Rich Hopkins is a husband, a father of 6, and a speaker dedicated to helping his audiences change their walk through life, regardless of their current circumstances, perceived limitations, or tangible obstacles. When he isn't speaking, he's coaching fellow professionals to find and share their most important messages, whether in the interest of business or personal achievement. He's the author of the highly regarded blog Speak and Deliver, as well as the book Go Ahead and Laugh, a serious guide to speaking with humor. Tonight, Rich is going to speak on one of 5 topics, but doesn't know which. I have the topics in front of me. Somebody, please, give me a number between 1 and 5.
3.
3. Great. Tonight, Rich will be speaking on comic books. Rich Hopkins.
Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, including, obviously, our guests, who you mentioned you were a Toastmaster back in Ohio, so it's nice to have a full room of Toastmasters. I'm counting you anyway. Comic books. I love comic books. I don't love them as much now, though, as I did when I was about so high. When I was 7 years old, I used to read comic books all the time. And you know where I got them? The library. Because I didn't like to read real books back then. I was able to get on my bike, and since this was 1975, I could go by myself out of the neighborhood, onto the busy road, down about 2 miles, and go to the library by myself, and check out 5 comics at a time. And I would do that every single day. My favorite character? The Flash. Anybody not know who the Flash is? World's fastest man alive. Now, I'm not quite sure why I loved him so much. Maybe it was because he was so much the opposite of me. I would lose a road race to the turtle. And it wasn't because I was the overconfident hare, it's because the turtle would simply move faster than me. So who better to emulate than the fastest man alive? Who better to look up to? I mean, yeah, I could have been Superman, but did I really want to be from another planet? I could have been Batman. That would have been nice. I would have been rich, but I wouldn't have been very fast, and I don't know how good I would have been swinging from building to building. I had just gone like that. And that would have been over pretty quick. Comic books became more real for me when I turned 9 years old. I had a bike accident, scraped up my face, was home from school for a week, and my dad brought me home a giant tabloid comic book. Superman versus Wonder Woman, set back in the 40s as they attempted to stop Hitler. It was pretty awesome. And it was at that moment that I started buying them for myself. And I collected comic books between the ages of 9 and 18 years old. I didn't eat lunch at school for almost all those years because I would save my lunch money so that I could go down to the comic book shop and buy The Flash, the Justice League of America, Batman and Superman and Green Lantern. I had stacks of comic books of each one. The older I got, the more money I had, I started to go back. I'd buy comic books from the 60s, from the times when comics were so innocent. They didn't have all the garbage you see in comic books now. My son checked out a graphic novel at the library. You open it up, it was nudity and drug use. Like, you're not reading this. He didn't really notice, but I noticed, my wife noticed, how back then, comic books were good. Comic books had moral values. People didn't kill each other unless you were a villain. Villains killed. Superheroes didn't. But half the times, even the villains didn't kill. It was just a lot of mayhem. Kind of like the movies you see where nobody really dies, nobody ever gets hit by bullets. Those are the comic books that we had back in the day. When I turned 18, went off to college, I didn't have the money anymore. I simply couldn't afford to keep buying those comic books and do things that I was wanting to do in college. You know, like date. Things that people who buy comic books don't typically do. So I started to do that, and the comic books went off to the wayside. I still had my collection of about 4,500 comics, and they were in these giant white boxes, all individually sealed in plastic bags. And I would take them with me from dorm room to apartment, eventually out here to Denver, Colorado, when I was 22 years old. And then something really awful happened. I couldn't make my rent. Back then it was $475. I hadn't had a job in about a month, and I didn't know how I was going to stay. I certainly wasn't going to move away from Denver. I was an adult now. I wasn't going to go back. So I took every box of comic books up to Mile High Comics and sold them for about 5% the value they actually had. My childhood went to my apartment. Now, I tried to justify this in my own mind. I just sold them a big bunch of newsprint so that I could pay my rent. Idiots. But I couldn't really swallow that, because I knew it wasn't true. Those boxes represented my past. They represented an ideal that I grew up believing in. Represented hour after hour of me laying on the floor, turning page after page, memorizing the writers and the artists and the editors of these comics, drawing, trying to be just as good as all the people who drew those comic books, dreaming of writing them someday. And what did I do? The same thing I did when I went to college. I traded in that dream of writing and drawing comic books for business, for going into graphic design, so I could design advertising. And later on, what did I do? I mortgaged that childhood simply to pay the rent. And I haven't been able to afford comic books since. Something about having 6 kids kind of prevents you from having a room full of Flash comics. Thank goodness for the movie theaters and the fact that all my old characters are now on the big silver screen, and I can share them with my kids that way. Every once in a while I'll take them down to the comic book shop and they'll pick out a few comics and I'll read through them, and they don't resemble anything that I used to read. They might be wearing some of the same costumes, they might have the same names, but the stories just aren't the same. My childhood, poof. But I suppose my grandparents would have said the same thing about the comics I read. And I suppose my kids will feel the same way if someday they sell their comic books and read their own kids. It's all about generations. Comic books meant the world to me. Maybe they will again someday. But for now, I am who I am. Not the fastest man alive, but at least a fairly confident speaker. Mr. Toastmaster.